This is the Linguistics 3 video lecture for Chapter 6 on Languages of the Greater Middle East. The Middle East is home to a variety of language families. A major one of these that we'll get into is the Turkic family, which includes Turkish most notably, and also the Afro-Asiatic family, which includes some languages that are very, very widely spoken. The subgroups of the Afro-Asiatic family are the Semitic group, Egyptian, and Berber. The Turkic language family is pretty large. It includes about 40 languages, so many of these are less well known to those of us in the West, aside from Turkish, of course. These languages are spoken by about 170 million native speakers. So lots of languages, lots of speakers. It also is a language family that encompasses a very large geographical territory. So the region in which Turkic languages are spoken stretches from the Balkans in sort of Eastern Europe area over to Eastern Siberia in Russia and Western China, sort of more in the south. We've actually come across some of these Turkic languages before. When we looked at languages of Siberia, for example, a language called Yakut that we touched on. Also in the Caucasus region, we saw a language called Kumyk. That's also a Turkic language. So very, very large geographical territory. So you get a visual sense of the range geographically of the Turkic languages. This map shows the languages in the red on the kind of bottom left part of the map. That's the more Eastern European, Middle Eastern location of the Turkic languages, particularly Turkey, which is most of that red. And then we can see it stretches all the way over into the far upper right of this portion of the map, and that's the Eastern Siberia Turkic languages. So as I mentioned, most notably in the Turkic language family, we have the Turkish language, spoken by about 80 million native speakers, mostly in Turkey, of course. Another large language in this family is Azerbaijani, spoken by 26 million people, mostly in Azerbaijan. Kazakh, spoken by 11 million people. And Turkmen, spoken by 8 million people. These are just some of the largest languages, but there are a few others in this family with still pretty substantial speaker numbers. So there are a lot of speakers of Turkic languages in the world. So even though the Turkic language family is pretty well studied and has a lot of speakers from which we can draw data to learn more about it, classification into branches within this family is actually kind of controversial. This is partially because the languages within this family are very close linguistically. They have a lot of similarities that make it difficult to draw very clear, hard lines between them. This is also because, as I'm sure you are well aware, the Middle East has a long history of a lot of conflict, a lot of turmoil, a lot of changing hands of power, and this has led to large population movements, so migration, also politics surrounding language, but also ethnicity and national identification. All of this has led to some confusion regarding the names of the languages and the dialects. There's not a good obvious one-to-one correspondence between language and nation. Um, there have been new distinctions that have been overlaid onto old ones that has also created some confusion in this regard. So all of this has made it somewhat difficult to very clearly classify and identify the languages and the groups within this family. So what do we mean when we say that the Turkic languages are very similar to each other? One aspect of this similarity is probably the most obvious one at first glance, is that there is a lot of similarity in the vocabulary of these languages. And I invite you at this moment to take a look at page 156 of your textbook. This has a chart of cognates in several Turkic languages. So Turkish, Azeri, Turkmen, and a few others, and some pretty basic vocabulary words, and you can see how they really share a lot in common. Some of the words are actually exactly the same across these languages. Another similarity across most Turkic languages, except for Uzbek, is one exception in this regard. There is vowel harmony. This, as we discussed in a previous lesson, involves all the vowels in a word needing to be members of the same subclass. So when you're attaching, say, a particular suffix to the root of a word, say a verb, that suffix has to change to agree with whatever vowel was in that root. The Turkic languages are also a really great example of languages that use agglutinative morphology. So just to again review what that entails, agglutinative morphology involves attaching discrete parts, so different affixes, often suffixes, to roots of words in order to indicate various grammatical features. And it's called agglutinative because, well, the word is associated with glue, so you can kind of that can help you to remember, hopefully, that you remember glue. Okay, that means these parts are glued together, that they don't change fundamentally aspects of themselves, but rather they're just kind of attached one after the other. We can see an example of this agglutinative morphology in action in an example from Turkish. So the word evlerinizden in Turkish, this is a word that it's a rather long word. It has multiple meanings in the word. It means from your houses, where the your is plural. Notice in English we don't actually have a word for your plural, so that's why that's indicated in parentheses there in the translation. So to break this word down, we have ev first, which means house, ler, which means plural, iniz, which is you, also plural, and den, which is the ablative case. So that's a morpheme that indicates the ablative case is essentially encoded in English using the word from. So that's kind of, you could think of it as our word for, the Turkish word for from, even though it's not actually a word on its own in Turkish. Because as we've talked about, agglutinative languages tend to use these little morphemes as attachments to indicate things that in a language like English we would actually have a separate word for. The Turkic languages also lack grammatical gender entirely. they don't even have it in the personal pronouns. So their third person pronoun, what in English would be like he or she, that's just a single word. And finally, the Turkic languages are characterized for the most part by a subject, object, verb, or SOV word order. One additional very interesting, I think, feature of Turkic languages is that many of these, not all, there are some exceptions, but many Turkic languages use markers to encode what we call evidentiality. Evidentiality is a way of indicating with your grammar, essentially, how you came about the information that you're saying to someone. So in English, we don't encode for evidentiality using grammar or using markers like the Turkic languages do. We would really just say using a bunch of words like, oh, I heard from my friend so and so that blah blah blah, whatever the information is. Or I saw with my own eyes that, say, it's cloudy outside. Um, Languages that encode for evidentiality, though, they have little markers for all of these different ways of arriving at the information that you are giving to someone. The Turkish language, for example, they use this suffix mish, um, which can be added to encode direct evidentiality. This is something that is essentially present in the speaker's consciousness most of the time because they observed it themselves, or possibly through their imagination, say if they're talking about a dream they had or something. But it's essentially something that is present in their own mind as opposed to, say, someone else's mind. This is a very interesting feature of languages that uh, is a little bit difficult to imagine if you don't have it in your own language. So it takes a little bit of imagination, we'll say. But it's interesting, I think, to think about what encoding for evidentiality grammatically does for a person's cognition. So this is an area that is related directly to linguistic relativity that we've kind of touched on a bit in this course that I want you to kind of continue thinking about. With this example of evidentiality, you might ask, how would constantly having to encode for evidentiality, so constantly having to attach some particle to your sentence to indicate how you got your information, how might that affect how you think about information and how you think about the source of your information? Might it affect how people, say, lie, or how they are, say, suspicious of someone's information that they're giving them? I think it's possible that it could have interesting implications for those kinds of situations.